Picture this. You're standing in the Grand Cathedral of Westminster Abbey in the year 1501, watching what appears to be a fairy tale wedding unfold before your eyes. The bride, a radiant Spanish princess named Catherine of Aragon, glides down the aisle in silk and gold, her dark eyes sparkling with hope and innocence. Beside her stands Prince Arthur, heir to the English throne, barely 15 years old but carrying himself with royal dignity. The ceremony is magnificent. Hundreds of nobles in their finest attire, soaring Gothic arches draped in tapestries, the sweet sound of choir voices echoing through the ancient stones. But what you're witnessing isn't a love story. It's the opening act of one of history's most twisted royal dramas, a marriage that will eventually tear apart the very fabric of Christianity in England, destroy lives, topple dynasties, and leave a trail of blood that stretches across centuries. Because beneath the pageantry and political promises, royal marriages have never been about love. They've been about power, bloodlines, and the ruthless pursuit of dynasty, often at a cost so horrific that it defies comprehension. The young princess standing at that altar has no idea that her marriage will become a pawn in a deadly game between kings, that she'll spend decades fighting for her legitimacy while her husband seeks to destroy her, or that her story will intertwine with some of the most disturbing and twisted royal unions in human history. Before diving into these forgotten stories of obsession, betrayal, and genetic catastrophe, if you enjoyed learning about the dark truths hidden behind royal glamour, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. Please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these twisted tales together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared fascination with the secrets that power tries to bury. What you're about to discover isn't just another collection of royal scandals. These are stories that reveal the true cost of absolute power, where individuals were reduced to tools of dynastic continuity, and children were forced into political roles far beyond their years, and where the pursuit of pure bloodlines created monsters that would haunt entire civilizations. The marriages we'll explore represent some of humanity's darkest impulses, dressed up in crowns and ceremonies, and their consequences echo through history even today. To understand these twisted royal marriages, we must first grasp the brutal logic that created them. For over 1,000 years, European royalty operated under a simple but devastating principle. Bloodline purity was more important than human welfare. They believed that royal blood was literally different from that of commoners. Divinely blessed, genetically superior, a sacred inheritance that must be preserved at all costs. This obsession with bloodline purity led to a practice that modern science has proven catastrophic: systematic inbreeding. Cousins married cousins, uncles married nieces, and in some cases, brothers married sisters, all in the name of keeping royal blood pure. What they created instead was a genetic nightmare that would produce some of history's most tragic figures: rulers who couldn't speak, children who couldn't walk, queens driven to madness, and dynasties that collapsed under the weight of their own corrupted DNA. The most infamous example of this genetic catastrophe was the Habsburg dynasty of Austria and Spain. Their family motto might as well have been, "Let others wage wars, we shall marry," because for 3 centuries they used marriage as their primary weapon of conquest. But their strategic marriages came with a terrible price. By the time the last Spanish Habsburg king, Charles II, was born in 1661, he was more inbred than a child whose parents were brother and sister. Charles couldn't speak until he was 4 years old. He couldn't walk until he was 8. His tongue was so large he could barely eat solid food, drool constantly pouring from his mouth. His jaw protruded so severely that his teeth couldn't meet, giving him the characteristic Habsburg jaw that had become increasingly pronounced with each generation of cousin marriages. But perhaps most tragic of all, Charles was impotent and intellectually disabled, the final broken endpoint of centuries of genetic manipulation. The physical deformities were horrifying enough, but the psychological damage was even worse. Charles lived in constant pain, suffered from epileptic seizures and was so mentally unstable that court officials had to make important decisions without consulting him. When he died in 1700 at age 38, he left no heirs, ending the Spanish Habsburg line forever and plunging Europe into the War of Spanish Succession. But Charles wasn't unique. He was simply the most visible victim of a system that had been destroying royal children for generations. His sister, Maria Theresa, suffered from similar deformities and died young. His cousin, Margaret Theresa, was married to her own uncle at age 15 and died 6 years later, her body unable to survive the repeated pregnancies that were demanded of her. The Habsburg family tree didn't branch. It was a twisted vine that choked itself in its own coils. The Spanish Habsburgs provide a perfect case study in how political ambition can create human monsters. Over 2 centuries, 11 Spanish Habsburg kings contracted marriages. 9 of these unions were between blood relatives, third cousins or closer. Each generation became more deformed, more mentally unstable, more incapable of ruling effectively. Yet the marriages continued because political alliances mattered more than human suffering. Court physicians documented these genetic disasters with clinical precision, but they never dared to suggest the obvious solution. Stop marrying relatives. Instead, they blamed mysterious ailments, divine displeasure, or the corrupted heir of certain palaces. The truth was too politically dangerous to acknowledge. The very foundation of royal legitimacy, the idea that royal blood was pure and sacred, depended on maintaining the fiction that these marriages were not only acceptable but divinely ordained. The psychological impact on the women trapped in these arrangements was particularly devastating. Imagine being told from birth that your only purpose in life is to marry your cousin, produce heirs, and preserve a bloodline that's already poisoned. Picture growing up knowing that your physical deformities, your mental struggles, your inability to bear healthy children all stem from decisions made by ancestors who valued political power more than human welfare. These women lived in constant fear of pregnancy, knowing that each conception might produce a child even more damaged than themselves. They endured miscarriage after miscarriage, watched their babies die in infancy, and blamed themselves for failures that were actually the inevitable result of genetic catastrophe. Many developed what we would now recognize as severe depression, anxiety disorders, and post-traumatic stress, conditions that were then dismissed as feminine weakness or divine punishment. But the Habsburg genetic experiment wasn't the only twisted marriage tradition that plagued royal houses. Ancient Egypt took the practice of royal incest to even more extreme levels, institutionalizing brother-sister marriage as a divine requirement. The pharaohs believed that marrying their siblings preserved their connection to the gods and maintained the purity of their divine essence. The Ptolemaic dynasty, which ruled Egypt for nearly 3 centuries after Alexander the Great's conquest, made sibling marriage a cornerstone of their rule. Generation after generation of Ptolemaic rulers married their own brothers and sisters, creating a genetic isolation that was even more severe than what the Habsburgs would later achieve. Cleopatra VII, the famous last pharaoh of Egypt, was the product of this systematic inbreeding. And modern DNA analysis suggests she may have suffered from obesity and other health problems as a direct result of her genetic inheritance. The most tragic victim of Egyptian royal incest was probably King Tutankhamun, whose mummy reveals the horrific consequences of high-level inbreeding. DNA analysis shows that his parents were likely siblings, and he suffered from a cleft palate, a club foot, numerous other physical deformities, and a compromised immune system that made him vulnerable to diseases that would normally be survivable. He died at just 19 years old, his body unable to cope with the accumulated genetic damage inherited from generations of incestuous marriages. These weren't isolated cases of royal excess. They were systematic programs of human destruction carried out over centuries by people who should have known better. The Inca Empire practiced similar traditions, with royal siblings required to marry each other to preserve the divine bloodline of the sun god. In Thailand, kings routinely married multiple half-sisters and cousins, creating harems that were essentially breeding programs designed to produce as many royal children as possible while maintaining bloodline purity. The psychological damage extended beyond the immediate victims to entire court systems that had to maintain elaborate fictions about these arrangements. Courtiers, physicians, and religious authorities all participated in a massive conspiracy of silence, pretending that obviously incestuous marriages were normal and healthy. They developed complex theological and medical justifications for practices that any objective observer could see were destroying the royal families they were supposed to protect. Perhaps most disturbing was how these twisted marriages became self-perpetuating cycles of abuse. Children who survived the genetic lottery often grew up to arrange similar marriages for their own offspring, having been conditioned to believe that royal blood was so precious that any suffering was justified to preserve it. They became both victims and participants in a system that valued lineage over individual humanity, rather than individuals deserving of dignity and choice. The consequences of these marriages extended far beyond the royal families themselves. When rulers were mentally unstable, physically deformed, or died young without clear heirs, entire kingdoms suffered. Succession crises led to civil wars, political instability weakened nations against foreign enemies, and the general population paid the price for their rulers' genetic catastrophes through higher taxes, military conscription, and economic disruption. The religious institutions that could have intervened instead provided theological cover for these practices. The Catholic Church, despite its teachings about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of avoiding sin, regularly granted special dispensations that allowed even the most closely related royals to marry. Church officials argued that royal bloodlines were divinely ordained, and that preserving their purity was more important than following normal moral guidelines. This collision between religious doctrine and political necessity created some of the most twisted moral compromises in history. Priests who preached about the importance of moral purity would bless marriages between uncles and nieces. Bishops who condemned incest among commoners would officiate at royal weddings that violated every principle they claimed to uphold. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also essential to maintaining the fiction that these arrangements were morally acceptable. As we delve deeper into these stories, we'll discover that the twisted nature of royal marriages went beyond just genetic manipulation. We'll explore unions that involved extreme age differences, forced marriages between children and adults, arrangements that involved coercive marriages with extreme power imbalance, and alliances that reduced women to bargaining chips in political negotiations to be traded between kingdoms. These weren't aberrations or isolated incidents. They were the normal functioning of a system that valued power above humanity. The women at the center of these arrangements developed remarkable strategies for survival in impossible circumstances. Some retreated into religious devotion, finding solace in faith when their earthly lives offered only suffering. Others became political operators in their own right, using what little power they had to protect themselves and their children. A few managed to find genuine love despite the political constraints of their marriages, creating islands of human connection in seas of manipulation and abuse. But survival came at a terrible cost. Even the most successful royal women of this era carried psychological scars that affected every aspect of their lives. They lived in constant fear of political changes that might strip away their protection, endured physical intimacy with men they often despised, and watched their children become pawns in the same deadly games that had shaped their own lives. The genetic consequences of these twisted marriages would echo through generations, creating bloodlines marked by madness, physical deformity, and early death. But the psychological and cultural consequences were even more lasting, establishing patterns of abuse, manipulation, and dehumanization that would influence royal behavior for centuries to come. Understanding these twisted royal marriages isn't just about satisfying historical curiosity. These stories reveal fundamental truths about how power corrupts, how institutional systems can perpetuate horrific abuses, and how individual human dignity gets sacrificed when political considerations take precedence over moral principles. The parallels to modern forms of systematic abuse and exploitation are uncomfortably clear. As we continue this journey through history's most disturbing royal unions, we'll meet women who were married to their brothers, children who were wed to adults old enough to be their grandparents, and queens whose love turned to obsession so complete that it destroyed not only their own lives but entire kingdoms. These aren't fairy tales. They're horror stories dressed up in silk and gold, cautionary tales about what happens when absolute power meets human weakness, and genetic science is ignored in favor of political ambition. The most chilling aspect of these twisted royal marriages isn't just the genetic catastrophe they created, it's how they transformed love itself into a weapon of political destruction. When human emotions became tools for dynastic ambition, the results were psychological horrors that make modern thrillers seem tame by comparison. Consider the case of Joanna of Castile, known to history as Joanna the Mad, whose marriage became a tragic example of how political unions could shatter the emotional well-being of those involved. Born in 1479 to Isabella and Ferdinand, the Catholic monarchs who expelled Jews and Muslims from Spain, Joanna seemed destined for greatness. She was intelligent, educated, fluent in multiple languages, and showed no early signs of the madness that would later define her legacy. But the seeds of her destruction were already planted in her genes. Her parents were cousins, part of the same interconnected web of European royalty that had been marrying within itself for generations. The real tragedy began when she was married at 16 to Philip the Handsome of Burgundy, a union arranged to strengthen political alliances between Spain and the Holy Roman Empire. What started as a calculated political arrangement quickly became emotionally overwhelming for Joanna, turning into a fixation that would later be seen as unstable, met with cold manipulation on Philip's. Philip was everything his nickname suggested: devastatingly handsome, charming when he chose to be, and utterly faithless. He treated his marriage as a political inconvenience, and his wife as an obligation to be endured between his numerous affairs. Joanna's response was intense, all-consuming devotion that others interpreted as madness. But was it really madness, or was it the natural response of a woman trapped in an impossible situation? She had been raised to believe that marriage was her highest calling, that producing heirs was her sacred duty, that her husband was her lord and master in all things. When that marriage became a source of constant humiliation and betrayal, her mind fractured under the pressure. The first signs of what courtiers called her madness appeared when she discovered one of Philip's mistresses. Her reaction was swift and violent. She attacked the woman with scissors, cutting off her hair and slashing her face. The incident shocked the court, but it was nothing compared to what would come later. As Philip's infidelities became more blatant and public, Joanna's behavior became increasingly erratic. She would fly into rages, refuse to eat for days, and spend hours weeping in her chambers. But the real horror began after Philip died suddenly in 1506, possibly from typhoid fever, though Joanna became convinced he had been poisoned by political enemies. Her grief transformed into something darker, more obsessive, more terrifying than anything the medieval world had ever witnessed. She refused to allow Philip's burial, insisting that he was merely sleeping and would wake up soon. What followed was one of history's most disturbing displays of grief-induced madness. Joanna traveled across Spain with Philip's coffin, clinging to Philip's remains in haunting rituals of grief, unable to let go, to speak to him as if he were still alive, to seek his counsel on political matters. She would remain beside his coffin for hours, speaking to him as if he could still hear her. The image is horrifying, but it speaks to a deeper truth about Joanna's condition. She had been so isolated, so deprived of genuine human connection, that even death couldn't break her attachment to the one person who had shown her attention, however cruel and manipulative that attention had been. Her behavior wasn't just madness, it was the logical extreme of a woman whose entire identity had been built around serving a man who never loved her. Her father Ferdinand and later her son Charles V used Joanna's supposed madness as a justification to lock her away for 46 years. She was imprisoned in the royal convent of Santa Clara in Tordesillas, where the conditions were deliberately designed to break whatever remained of her spirit. She was kept into dark, cold rooms, given minimal food, denied basic hygiene, and subjected to constant surveillance by guards who reported her every word and gesture to her captors. The attendants who served during her imprisonment left behind accounts that reveal the true nature of her confinement. Joanna would go weeks without washing, and tear her clothes to shreds, scream for hours at times, and refuse to participate in religious services. But these behaviors weren't symptoms of inherent madness. They were the natural responses of someone suffering from severe depression, anxiety, and post-traumatic stress. Conditions exacerbated by decades of isolation and systematic abuse. Modern historians increasingly believe that Joanna's madness was largely political, a convenient excuse to remove a legitimate queen from power while her male relatives ruled in her name. Her behavior, while extreme, can be understood as the desperate actions of someone whose capacity for normal human relationships had been destroyed by a system that valued her only for her ability to produce male heirs and legitimize political alliances. The genetic component of Joanna's condition cannot be ignored. Her family tree shows clear patterns of mental illness, depression, anxiety, and obsessive behaviors that become more common and more severe with inbreeding. Her great-grandmother had experienced similar episodes of what courtiers called melancholy madness. Her daughter Catherine would later show signs of severe depression and paranoid delusions. The pattern was clear to anyone willing to see it, but acknowledging the connection between inbreeding and mental illness would have undermined the entire foundation of royal legitimacy. Joanna died in 1555, still imprisoned, still officially mad, her death barely noted by the kingdom she had once been destined to rule. She had been erased from public memory decades earlier, written off as an inconvenient madwoman, rather than acknowledged as a victim of a system that destroyed women who dared to love too deeply or grieve too openly. But Joanna's story represents just one variation on the theme of how royal marriages could transform natural human emotions into instruments of destruction. The practice of marrying children to adults created even more disturbing scenarios, where the victims were too young to understand what was happening to them until it was far too late to escape. Princess Isabella of Valois provides a heartbreaking example of how political marriages could destroy childhood innocence in the name of diplomatic necessity. Born in 1389 in Paris, she was the daughter of Charles VI of France, known to history as Charles the Mad for his periodic bouts of insanity that may have been caused by the same genetic factors that plagued other royal bloodlines. Isabella's childhood was spent in the opulent but unstable French court, where her father's condition created an atmosphere of constant uncertainty. One day he might be a loving parent, bouncing her on his knee and showering her with gifts. The next he might be cowering in a corner, screaming that assassins were coming to kill him, or standing motionless for hours, convinced that his body was made of glass and would shatter if he moved. When Isabella was just 6 years old, she became a pawn in one of the most cynical diplomatic arrangements in medieval history. As part of a treaty to end the devastating Hundred Years' War between England and France, she was promised in marriage to Richard II of England, a man 23 years her senior. The wedding ceremony took place when she was 7, though the marriage wouldn't be consummated until she reached physical maturity, a protection that was written explicitly into the treaty but provided little comfort to a child who couldn't understand what was happening to her. The wedding itself was a spectacular display of royal pageantry designed to mask the disturbing reality of what was taking place. Isabella processed through London streets in a litter decorated with English roses and French lilies, symbolizing the union of two kingdoms. She wore a crown specially made for her small head, and her train was carried by English duchesses who had been chosen to serve as her guardians and teachers. But beneath the ceremony and celebration was a child who had been torn from everything familiar and thrust into a foreign court where she was expected to immediately adapt to new customs, a new language, and a new role as queen. The crowds that lined the streets called out blessings in English, which she was only beginning to understand, but she smiled and waved as she had been taught, already learning the performance skills that would be essential to her survival. Richard II initially treated Isabella with genuine kindness, perhaps seeing in her the daughter he never had rather than the wife she was destined to become. He installed her in her own apartments at Westminster Palace, staffed with a carefully chosen household that blended French and English attendants. Her days were filled with lessons in languages, music, and courtly accomplishments, but also in the complex etiquette of English court life. The king himself took an active interest in her education and welfare, visiting her apartments regularly and bringing her gifts from across his realm. Exotic birds from Ireland, fine books from Oxford, musical instruments crafted by London's best artisans. To outside observers, it might have seemed like a fairy tale arrangement, with the kind king protecting his child bride until she was old enough to fulfill her royal duties. But Isabella was perceptive enough to understand that her situation was precarious. She learned from other children at court about the political undercurrents that constantly swirled around royal marriages, about how queens could be divorced or executed if they failed to produce male heirs, about how foreign princesses were particularly vulnerable when their home countries could no longer protect them. Her fears proved justified when Richard II was overthrown by his cousin Henry Bolingbroke in 1399. The political stability that had allowed Isabella to feel safe at the English court crumbled overnight, and she found herself a prisoner in the Tower of London, her value as a diplomatic asset now complicated by the fact that her marriage to the deposed king made her a potential threat to the new regime. Henry IV faced a dilemma. Isabella was still legally Queen of England, but she was also a reminder of the legitimacy of the man he had overthrown. Keeping her in England risked creating a focal point for opposition to his rule, but sending her back to France might be interpreted as a sign of weakness. The solution was typical of royal politics in its cynical calculation. Isabella would be allowed to return to France, but only if she formally acknowledged Henry as the rightful king and renounced any claim she might have to the English throne as Richard's widow. For Isabella, now 11 years old, the choice was stark. Accept exile and acknowledge that her 4 years as Queen of England had been meaningless, or refuse and risk remaining a prisoner indefinitely. She was being asked to make a decision that would affect not only her own future, but the relationship between England and France for years to come. The negotiations for her release were kept deliberately vague, allowing both sides to interpret her departure as either voluntary or forced, depending on their political needs. When Isabella finally returned to France in 1401, she was leaving behind the only home she had known since early childhood, abandoning apartments where she had learned to read English poetry, gardens where she had played with other royal children, and the great hall where she had been crowned Queen of England. The reunion with her family was complicated by her father's deteriorating mental condition and her mother's calculation about how Isabella's unique position might be used to advance French interests. As the widow of an English king, Isabella had a diplomatic status that could prove valuable in future negotiations, but she also carried the psychological scars of someone who had learned too young that love and protection could be withdrawn without warning when political circumstances changed. Isabella's story illustrates how even the most apparently benign royal marriages could inflict lasting psychological damage on their victims. She had been treated with kindness by Richard II, but that kindness was always conditional, always dependent on political factors beyond her control. When those factors changed, she discovered that her value as a person was secondary to her value as a symbol, and that the protection she had enjoyed could disappear as quickly as it had been granted. The pattern would repeat itself throughout her life. Her second marriage to Charles of Orléans was happier and based on genuine affection, but even that relationship was shaped by the political realities of her position as a former Queen of England. She could never escape the shadow of her first marriage or the knowledge that her personal happiness was always subject to the larger forces of European politics. These stories of Joanna the Mad and Isabella of Valois reveal how royal marriages could destroy women in different but equally devastating ways. Joanna's passionate nature was twisted into obsessive madness by a system that demanded she love a man who could never love her back. Isabella's childhood innocence was sacrificed to political necessity, leaving her with psychological scars that would affect every relationship for the rest of her life. Both women were intelligent, capable individuals who might have led fulfilling lives under different circumstances. Instead, they became victims of a system that treated marriage as a political tool rather than a human relationship, that valued bloodline purity over personal welfare, and that sacrificed individual happiness to dynastic ambition without a second thought. The twisted nature of these royal marriages went beyond just the immediate suffering they caused. They established patterns of abuse and manipulation that would influence royal behavior for centuries, creating expectations about marriage, power, and gender roles that would trap future generations in similar cycles of dysfunction and destruction. As we continue exploring these dark chapters of royal history, we'll discover even more disturbing examples of how political ambition could corrupt the most basic human relationships, turning love into obsession, marriage into imprisonment, and the pursuit of power into a form of systematic torture that destroyed everyone it touched. The twisted psychology of royal marriages reached its most disturbing extremes when we examine how these arrangements could transform motherhood itself into a weapon of political destruction. Consider the tragic case of Margaret Theresa of Spain, born in 1651 into a world where her very existence was both miracle and curse. She was the daughter of Philip IV of Spain and his niece Mariana of Austria, yes, his niece. Because by this time, the Habsburg family had become so genetically isolated that uncles routinely married their brothers' daughters without anyone questioning the practice. Margaret Theresa's childhood is immortalized in the exquisite paintings of Diego Velázquez, but these masterpieces tell a story far darker than their beauty suggests. Look closely at these portraits, and you'll see what the artist was too diplomatic to emphasize but too honest to hide completely. The child's jaw already shows signs of the Habsburg deformity. Her eyes carry a distant quality that suggests developmental delays, and her posture hints at the spinal problems that plagued her bloodline. But the most tragic aspect of Margaret Theresa's story isn't her physical condition. It's her complete lack of agency over her own destiny. From the moment of her birth, every decision about her future was made by men who saw her not as a human being, but as a political chess piece. She was promised in marriage to her uncle Leopold I, Holy Roman Emperor, when she was still learning to walk. The engagement was celebrated across Europe as a diplomatic triumph, with elaborate ceremonies and public festivities that no one seemed to find disturbing, despite the obvious genetic implications. Margaret Theresa grew up knowing that her entire purpose in life was to marry her uncle and produce heirs to continue the Habsburg dynasty. She received the finest education available to women of her time: languages, music, painting, dancing. But all of these accomplishments were viewed merely as ways to make her a more attractive bride to her uncle husband. Every lesson, every skill, every moment of her childhood was shaped by the understanding that she existed to serve dynastic goals rather than to develop as an individual human being. The wedding took place in 1666, when Margaret Theresa was just 15 years old. Leopold was 26, old enough to be her father, and indeed, he was her father's brother. The ceremony was celebrated with elaborate pageantry designed to demonstrate the power and unity of the Habsburg dynasty. But for Margaret Theresa, it marked the end of whatever childhood she had left. The physical reality of her marriage was something court records hint at, but never explicitly describe. Margaret Theresa was expected to become pregnant immediately, despite her young age and the genetic factors that made healthy childbearing extremely difficult for Habsburg women. The pressure was immense. The continuation of two royal bloodlines depended on her ability to produce male heirs, and every month that passed without conception was seen as a personal failure. She did become pregnant multiple times, but the results were heartbreaking. Her first child, a daughter, survived only a few months before succumbing to the genetic defects that plagued Habsburg: offspring. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. When she finally gave birth to a son who survived infancy, the relief at court was palpable, until it became clear that the child had inherited the full spectrum of Habsburg genetic problems. Margaret Theresa herself grew weaker with each pregnancy. The combination of inbreeding-related health issues and the physical strain of constant childbearing took a devastating toll on her young body. Court physicians documented her decline with clinical precision, noting her increasing difficulty with speech, her frequent seizures, her inability to keep food down. But they never connected these symptoms to the obvious cause, the genetic damage caused by generations of family intermarriage. The psychological pressure was equally destructive. Margaret Theresa lived with the constant knowledge that her value as a person was directly tied to her reproductive success. Every pregnancy was scrutinized by court officials, every symptom analyzed for signs of potential problems. Every day that passed without conception was seen as evidence of her failure as a wife and queen. The young woman who had once painted delicate watercolors and played music with genuine joy became a hollow-eyed figure haunted by the weight of dynastic expectations. She died in 1673, just 6 years after her marriage at the age of 21. The official cause of death was listed as fever, but the reality was that her body had simply surrendered to the accumulated weight of genetic defects and physical trauma. Her death was mourned throughout the empire, but not for the right reasons. Courtiers and diplomats lamented the loss of a potential source of heirs, not the tragedy of a young woman whose life had been consumed by the expectations of a dynasty desperately clinging to its lineage. Margaret Theresa's story reveals how the twisted logic of royal marriage could transform even the most natural human experiences into sources of terror and suffering. Pregnancy, which should have been a time of joy and anticipation, became a medical emergency that threatened her life. Motherhood, which should have brought fulfillment, became a series of heartbreaking losses that destroyed her emotionally. Marriage, which should have provided companionship and love, became a clinical arrangement focused entirely on reproductive outcomes. But perhaps even more disturbing is how the system that destroyed Margaret Theresa was celebrated and defended by the very people who witnessed its effects. Court physicians wrote detailed reports about her declining health, but never suggested that cousin marriage might be the cause. Religious authorities blessed her union with elaborate ceremonies while ignoring the obvious moral problems with marrying blood relatives. Political advisors celebrated the diplomatic advantages of the marriage while dismissing the human cost as irrelevant to their calculations. The pattern repeated itself across Europe as royal families continued to marry within their own bloodlines despite mounting evidence of the genetic consequences. In France, the court of Louis XIV provided a slightly different but equally twisted variation on these themes, where royal marriages became elaborate theatrical performances designed to hide the psychological and physical dysfunction beneath the surface. Anne of Austria, who married Louis XIII in 1615, experienced a different kind of torture within the gilded cage of royal marriage. Born in 1601, she was the daughter of Philip III of Spain and Margaret of Austria, another uncle-niece pairing that had become standard practice among the Habsburgs. Her marriage to the French king was part of a complex diplomatic arrangement meant to cement peace between two powers that had been at war for decades. But what no one anticipated was the psychological catastrophe that would unfold when Anne found herself trapped between impossible expectations and genetic realities. As Queen of France, she was expected to produce male heirs to secure the succession, but as a Habsburg, she carried genetic defects that made healthy childbearing extremely difficult. Her first several pregnancies ended in miscarriage or infant death, each loss adding to her depression and the political pressure surrounding her position. The court physicians, following the primitive medical understanding of their era, blamed Anne for these reproductive failures. They subjected her to increasingly painful and humiliating treatments, bloodletting, purging, bizarre dietary restrictions, and intimate examinations that violated every principle of human dignity. They examined her body like mechanics studying a broken machine, looking for defects that might explain her inability to produce living heirs. But the real torture was psychological. Anne lived with the constant awareness that her value as a person was directly tied to her reproductive success, and her repeated failures made her a target of court gossip and political intrigue. Nobles whispered that she was cursed, that God disapproved of the Spanish marriage, that France needed a new queen who could actually fulfill her primary royal duty, The pressure became so intense that Anne developed what modern medicine would recognize as severe agoraphobia. She became afraid to appear in public, spending days at a time hidden in her private apartments. Her relationship with Louis XIII deteriorated as both partners blamed each other for their childlessness. They began living essentially separate lives, coming together only when court protocol demanded joint appearances. Anne turned to religion for comfort, spending hours in prayer and developing an almost obsessive devotion to Catholic ritual, perhaps hoping that divine intervention might succeed where medical treatment had failed. The miracle, when it finally came after 23 years of marriage, seemed almost supernatural. Anne gave birth to a healthy son, the future Louis XIV, the Sun King. The birth was celebrated throughout France as a sign of divine favor, but for Anne it represented both triumph and renewed terror. She knew that her primary value lay in her ability to produce heirs, and now she faced the pressure to repeat the success. A second son, Felipe, was born 2 years later, securing the succession and finally giving Anne some relief from the constant pressure. But the physical and emotional toll of her years of suffering could not be undone. Anne remained a deeply anxious, depressed woman who found little joy even in her eventual success as a mother. Her later years were marked by increasing physical problems and what court doctors described as melancholy attacks that left her bedridden for days at a time. The irony of Anne's story is that her greatest triumph, producing the heir who would become one of France's most powerful monarchs, came at such enormous personal cost that it destroyed her capacity to enjoy her success. She had spent so many years believing herself a failure that she could never fully accept her eventual vindication. The psychological damage inflicted by decades of reproductive pressure and public scrutiny had become permanent, shaping her personality in ways that no amount of political success could repair. These stories of Margaret Theresa and Anne of Austria reveal how royal marriages could weaponize the most fundamental aspects of human experience. Sexuality became a matter of state policy rather than personal intimacy. Pregnancy became a political event rather than a private joy. Motherhood became a performance rather than a relationship. The natural rhythms of human reproduction were subordinated to the artificial demands of dynastic succession, creating psychological pressures that few people could survive intact. The twisted nature of these arrangements extended beyond just the immediate participants to encompass entire court systems that had to maintain elaborate fictions about what was happening. Physicians had to pretend that obvious genetic problems were mysterious ailments. Courtiers had to celebrate marriages that any objective observer could see were destructive. Religious authorities had to bless unions that violated basic moral principles. Everyone became complicit in a system that prioritized bloodline purity over basic human dignity, that these arrangements were normal and healthy. Perhaps most disturbing was how these twisted marriages became normalized through repetition and institutional support. Each generation of royal children grew up seeing cousin marriage, child marriage, and loveless political unions as natural and inevitable. They internalized the values that had destroyed their parents and grandparents, then passed those same destructive patterns onto their own children. The system became self-perpetuating, creating cycles of abuse that continued for centuries because no one with the power to change things could imagine alternatives. The religious institutions that should have provided moral guidance instead became enablers of these practices. The Catholic Church, despite its teachings about the sanctity of marriage and the importance of avoiding sin, regularly granted dispensations that allowed even the most closely related royals to marry. Church officials developed elaborate theological justifications for practices that violated their own moral teachings, arguing that royal bloodlines were divinely ordained and that preserving their purity was more important than following normal ethical guidelines. This collision between religious doctrine and political necessity created some of the most twisted moral compromises in human history. The same priests who preached about the importance of moral purity would officiate at weddings between uncles and nieces. The same bishops who condemned incest among commoners would bless royal marriages that were genetically identical to brother-sister unions. The hypocrisy was staggering, but it was also essential to maintaining the fiction that these arrangements were morally acceptable. The long-term consequences of these twisted royal marriages extended far beyond the immediate suffering they caused to individual participants. They established cultural patterns that normalized the treatment of women as property, that justified the sacrifice of individual welfare for political goals, and that created expectations about marriage and family relationships that would influence society for generations. The damage wasn't limited to royal families, it permeated entire social structures, creating attitudes about power, gender, and human worth that would take centuries to overcome. As we prepare to explore even more disturbing examples of how royal marriages could corrupt basic human relationships, it's important to understand that these weren't aberrations or isolated incidents. They were the normal functioning of a system that had lost sight of fundamental moral principles in its pursuit of political power. The stories we've examined so far represent just the beginning of a much darker pattern of institutional abuse that would claim countless victims before finally being recognized for what it truly was: a systematic program of human destruction disguised as diplomatic necessity. The psychological manipulation reached its most sinister form when royal marriages were used to literally erase human identity. Children were torn from their families, forced to forget their names, their languages, their very sense of self, all to serve the twisted ambitions of dynasties that treated individuals as pawns in a grand political game, with little regard for personal identity. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of these arrangements wasn't the immediate suffering they caused. It was how they created feedback loops of trauma that echoed through generations. Women who survived these marriages often became the architects of similar arrangements for their own children, having been so thoroughly broken by the system that they could no longer imagine alternatives. They passed on not just genetic damage, but psychological conditioning that normalized the most horrific abuses as necessary sacrifices for royal duty. The courts that enabled these practices developed elaborate rituals and ceremonies designed to mask the underlying horror. Marriage negotiations were conducted like military campaigns, with detailed intelligence about potential brides' fertility, genetic backgrounds, and psychological vulnerabilities. Children were evaluated like livestock, their worth calculated based on bloodline purity, political connections, and reproductive potential, rather than any consideration of their humanity or individual worth. What makes these historical atrocities particularly relevant today is how they reveal the enduring human capacity for institutional evil disguised as noble purpose. The same psychological mechanisms that allowed medieval courts to celebrate child marriage and systematic inbreeding continue to operate in modern contexts, where political expedience still trumps human welfare, and powerful institutions still sacrifice the vulnerable to protect their own interests. The twisted royal marriages we've explored weren't products of ignorance or primitive thinking. They were the deliberate choices of educated, sophisticated people who understood exactly what they were doing. They had access to centuries of evidence about the consequences of inbreeding, the psychological damage caused by forced marriages, and the human cost of treating people as political assets. They chose to ignore this evidence because acknowledging it would have threatened the power structures that benefited them. The women whose stories we've uncovered, from the genetically damaged Habsburg princesses to the child brides traded between kingdoms, deserve to be remembered not as historical curiosities, but as victims of systematic abuse whose suffering reveals eternal truths about the corruption of absolute power. Their pain wasn't meaningless. It teaches us that no political goal, no matter how seemingly important, justifies the deliberate destruction of human lives. These twisted royal marriages finally came to an end, not through moral enlightenment, but through practical necessity. As genetic science advanced and international standards changed, even the most traditionalist royal houses could no longer ignore the mounting evidence that their marriage practices were destroying their own bloodlines. The last gasps of royal inbreeding died out with World War I, not because rulers suddenly developed consciences, but because the political systems that had sustained these practices for centuries finally collapsed under their own contradictions. Today, as we witness new forms of institutional abuse and systematic exploitation, the stories of these forgotten royal victims serve as warnings about what happens when power operates without accountability, when tradition becomes more important than human welfare, and when societies choose comfortable lies over uncomfortable truths. The marble halls may be silent now, but their echoes still demand our attention, our remembrance, and our commitment to ensuring that such systematic cruelty never again masquerades as noble purpose.